Ukrainian soldiers demonstrated the synchronized and coordinated work of the units from the 2nd Tank Battalion in the Pokrovsk direction. The fighters said that 2 crews opened fire simultaneously in different settlements and, with direct fire, destroyed buildings where the enemy had set up their positions. As a result, Russian infantry was eliminated.
This combat episode is not just a coincidence. It is proof of coordinated combat skill and readiness to act decisively under any conditions. We work in sync, strike accurately, and keep moving forward. From a statement by the 5th Separate Heavy Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces on Facebook.
Since the beginning of the day, Ukrainian soldiers have repelled 26 Russian attacks on the Pokrovsk section of the front. The enemy unsuccessfully tried to break through the defense forces' positions near 14 settlements. Another 12 Russian assaults were repelled in the Novopavlivka sector. There, the Russians attempted to advance near 10 settlements.
We understand that the enemy has set themselves the goal of advancing far enough to encircle the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration and to use the so-called Avdiivka scenario, namely, to destroy the defense or weaken it as much as possible by delivering artillery and air strikes against the group of troops defending there. That's exactly why we're now seeing such desperate attempts by the enemy to break through around Pokrovsk.
Our soldiers have also steadfastly repelled enemy attacks in other directions. In particular, more than 13 assaults in total have been repelled in Lyman, Siversk, Kupiansk, Kramatorsk, Pridniprovsk, Toretsk, and Orakiv directions. Ukrainian soldiers note that when the sky is buzzing with Russian FPVs and Mavics, the mobile fire teams of the armed forces of Ukraine cover the infantry and go out to hunt for drones that the enemy launches over the front line.
We can accompany ground force units, meaning we cover them from above. When the Russian occupiers realize that we are in the air, they can't get their own drones up over this area.
Since the beginning of the day, the enemy has made another 10 unsuccessful attempts to storm the positions of the defense forces on the North Slobozansky and Kursk sections of the front. However, as military experts note, it is actually the Ukrainian armed forces units that are conducting active offensive operations in the North Slobozansky direction.
From the very beginning, it was clear that in the Sumy direction, the enemy did not have either a numerical or qualitative advantage that would allow them to carry out large-scale offensive actions. Of course, these simple words should make it clear to everyone that it is only as a result of the active counteroffensive and defensive actions of Ukraine's defense forces that such offensive actions by the enemy have become impossible. In some areas, the penetration of Ukrainian troops into the enemy's defenses reaches up to 2.5 to 3 kilometers, which creates a serious threat for the enemy, who has found themselves in an operational pocket, in this case, a tactical pocket.
Fighters from the Special Operations Forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces reported a successful raid behind enemy lines. Ukrainian soldiers carried out a raid on a Russian position near the border with the Russian Federation. As a result of the operation, enemy personnel were eliminated and the exchange fund was replenished. In the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated another 1,130 Russian soldiers. In addition, the day before, Ukrainian defenders destroyed 3 Russian tanks, 4 armored combat vehicles, more than 120 drones, and also disabled 105 units of automotive and special equipment belonging to the invaders. According to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russia has already lost more than 1,035,000 of its soldiers.
Military expert Sergei Hrabsky is joining our broadcast. Sergei Maritovic, welcome to the Freedom Broadcast.
Hello.
Hello, greetings to the studio.
Sergei Maritovic, so the strategic grouping is forming. Speaker Viktor Trihobov says that there are currently 2 main directions on the front that are the hottest, the most saturated with Russian attacks. These are the eastern flank of Pokrovsk and Novopavlivsk. What is your assessment? How accurate and sober is this evaluation of the situation at the front, that the majority of Russian attacks, assaults, and offensives are happening precisely in these areas?
Yes, absolutely right. And I can completely agree with that. Moreover, we understand that the enemy has set themselves the goal of advancing far enough to encircle the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration and to use the so-called Avdiivka scenario, namely, to destroy the defense or weaken it as much as possible by delivering artillery and air strikes against the group of troops defending there. That is exactly why we are now witnessing such desperate attempts by the enemy to break through around Pokrovsk from the north, in order to create a pocket that would allow them to concentrate their firepower precisely in this direction. As for the Novopavlivka direction, it is also extremely important for the enemy because, firstly, it opens the road to the Dnipropetrovsk region towards the settlement of Pokrovsk. But this is a transit route to the Zaporizhia region, and in this direction the enemy is trying to advance as far as possible into the territory of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. But so far, they have not yet reached the Dnipropetrovsk region with the aim of taking control of the Kurakhov-Pokrovsk highway in order to be able to continue their offensive in this direction. This is basically the reason why we are seeing right now that the enemy is desperately focusing its efforts precisely on these two sections of the front.
Let's discuss this further. Russian forces have tripled the number of assault operations on the islands near Kherson. Instead of 2 or 3 attempts to advance per day, the Russians are now carrying out on average from 6 to 11 attacks. This was reported by the spokesperson for the Defense Forces of Southern Ukraine, Vladislav Voloshin. And according to him, the Russian occupiers have become more active throughout the entire island zone, from the south all the way to, for example, the Antonivsky Road and rail bridges. Well, the islands are, in general, quite difficult when it comes to defensive positions. What is the reason for such activities specifically in this area? And honestly, does our enemy actually have any chances there?
Well, they don't have any chances. That's clear right away. And this activity is basically connected to what we've just been talking about. That is, the enemy has concentrated its main efforts on the Donetsk direction, meaning they are conducting the main combat operations in the Pokrovsk, Novopavlivka, Torets, and now Ulyanovsk sectors of the Donetsk direction, and they are also carrying out active combat operations, I emphasize active combat operations, on all other sections of the front. In particular, what you mentioned about the Kherson direction is also observed in other areas, for example, in the Slobozhansk and Lyman sectors, among others. Well, this generally fits into the standard offensive scheme, that is, to concentrate a strike group in 1 or 2 directions and conduct combat operations there, while on other fronts creating pressure that prevents the enemy, in this case the Ukrainian Defense Forces, from moving any reserves or reinforcing their groups on the main sections of the front. In other words, to put it simply, it's about distracting attention and spreading out the defending side's resources. That's exactly why there's such activity both in the Kherson direction you mentioned and in other areas of the front where the enemy is carrying out separate tactical offensive actions.
Sergei Meritovic, in recent days, Ukraine's defense forces have carried out a number of successful counterattacks in the north of the Sumy region. In your opinion, how likely is it that a large-scale Russian offensive could happen there?
You know, from the very beginning it was clear that in the Sumy direction, the enemy does not have either a quantitative or qualitative advantage that would allow them to conduct large-scale offensive operations. Of course, these simple words should correspond to the fact that everyone needs to understand. It is only as a result of the active counteroffensive and defensive actions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces that such offensive actions by the enemy have become impossible.
Nevertheless, what we are seeing right now rules out the possibility of any offensive actions by the enemy.
Right now, the enemy is desperately trying to repel our counterattacks, barely managing to hold their positions in certain areas. And here, the main thing for them is to make sure that the areas they control don't collapse, as the military say, and that they are able to hold on to them. But the penetration of Ukrainian troops into the enemy's defenses in some directions reaches up to 2.5 to 3 kilometers, which creates serious threats for the enemy who has found themselves in an operational, or in this case, a tactical encirclement. Therefore, no, we do not foresee or expect any serious offensive actions from the enemy here. Well, First of all, because they are occupied with the Donetsk direction, and secondly, it simply wasn't part of their objectives. And that group is not capable of carrying out a massive breakthrough and advancing on Sumy as the regional center.
About the Russians' tactics. So, the so-called kill zone, the assault troops tried to break through it with lightning speed. For this, they used motorcycles, buggies, and other such lightweight vehicles, as they're called. Now, there have been reports that they're crawling, covering themselves with some kind of invisibility cloaks, slowly, perhaps. But that's how they managed to capture a grove or a house on the outskirts of a village, using exactly this method. So, the tactic itself isn't new, but lately there have been more and more reports about the Russians using this kind of approach. In other words, the goal isn't to cross the kill zone quickly, but rather to do it unnoticed by drones. How effective is this tactic? What do you know about this?
Well, effectiveness can be evaluated from different perspectives. From the perspective of conducting an offensive operation, it's not effective because, basically, the 2 months of offensive actions by the Russians have shown that they haven't achieved any significant results. But from the enemy's point of view, it's quite effective because they are moving forward, or at least that's what they believe. And that's why, in our reports, we note the enemy's advance by 100 or 200 meters per day. For the second or already the third month of the offensive, this isn't really an indicator that shows the offensive is effective. But nevertheless, the enemy considers this tactic very successful, even though, out of those crawling forward, only 1 or 2 survive, and basically, someone else just crawls up to take their place. So basically, the only thing that's changed is the means they use to achieve results. But the number of losses that the Russian Federation suffers and takes hasn't changed. But for them, this is still acceptable for now. For now, it's still doable for them, and they can report up the chain, as they say, about significant successes, advancing, 100, 200, 500 meters a day into Ukrainian territory.
About the cooperation between Russia and North Korea. North Korea is currently supplying Russia with up to 40% of the ammunition for the war against Ukraine, because the partnership between Pyongyang and Moscow is deepening. This was reported by the head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, in an interview with Bloomberg, and according to him, Kim Jong-un is also transferring ballistic missiles and artillery systems to the Russian Federation. At the same time, Russia is providing North Korea with money, technology, and is helping to ease Pyongyang's international isolation. Budanov also said, "We have a quote, and we'll discuss it afterwards."
Currently, North Korea.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Supplies Russia with up to 40% of the ammunition used in the war against Ukraine, as the partnership between Pyongyang and Moscow grows stronger. This is good weaponry. North Korea has huge stockpiles, and production is running around the clock. Kirill Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in an interview with Bloomberg.
Well, 40% is a significant portion of all the ammunition. Without North Korea, without this cooperation, could Moscow have managed or not really? What do you think?
I think that the pace of the offensive and the rate of Moscow's aggressive actions would have been reduced by at least half. Because despite the fact that they have repeatedly claimed to have expanded weapons production and increased the output of arms and ammunition, in reality, this increase turned out to be very limited. Therefore, without such massive support from North Korea, it is unlikely that Russia would have been capable of conducting such active combat operations. On the other hand, Russia has found itself in, a kind of logistical dead end or trap, because North Korea is very cynically taking advantage of the current situation as it is supplying Russia with weapons and ammunition that only it possesses. In other words, North Korea is, if you will, making Russia a hostage to its supplies, which Russia cannot refuse, because even the calibers of North Korean systems are different from the Russian ones. Accordingly, it's impossible to use the ammunition.
And North Korea, well, let's put it this way, hit the jackpot here, getting the opportunity to receive additional resources and to supply its own weapons and military equipment, which is, generally speaking, very advantageous for them.
And as for Russia, once again it has shown just how incapable it is of scaling up military operations and conducting them using only its own resources.
Sergei Meritovic, thank you for joining us on our broadcast. Thank you for your comments. Sergei Hrabsky, military expert, was in touch with our studio.